That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
What if one episode of The Twilight Zone was so provocative, so unsettling, it was banned for over 50 years, erased from TV history, and never spoken of again? Why was it hidden? What was so dangerous about a simple attic, a sword, and a conversation between two men? Today, we uncover the story of The Encounter, the episode CBS tried to bury, and what its long silence reveals about fear, censorship, and the power of uncomfortable truths.
Come on, Bert, I have plans tonight. Where's your Christmas spirit?
The same place your Christmas bonus will be if I don't get those copies.
More than 60 years ago, The Twilight Zone debuted on American television and quietly redefined what sci-fi storytelling could be. Hosted and largely written by Rod Serling, the series didn't just entertain viewers with stories of aliens, time travel, or dystopian futures. It asked difficult questions, often using fictional premises to explore very real concerns about the world people were living in. In doing so, it became one of the most influential shows in television history. Before we go any further, here's your reminder to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on your daily dose of TV bloopers. The format was simple. Each episode told a standalone story, usually around 25 minutes long, featuring new characters and a fresh narrative. But what made the show different was its willingness to dig into the emotional, moral, and political fears that many people were trying to avoid. This was not just a show about robots or mysterious disappearances. It was a reflection of the time and of the anxieties that came with it. Rod Serling, the man behind the voice and most of the scripts, served in World War II. He had seen real violence and loss. And when he returned, he wasn't interested in making shows that ignored reality. Instead, he used television to explore what he believed to be some of the most pressing issues of the day: fear of nuclear war, distrust in government, civil rights, and the question of what kind of society we're all building together. When The Twilight Zone premiered in 1959, the United States was at a unique point in its history. The post-war economy was booming, the space race was underway, and for many Americans, life seemed secure. But under the surface, there were serious concerns. The Cold War had created a constant fear of nuclear disaster. McCarthyism had left a chilling effect on public discourse. Civil rights movements were gaining momentum, but so was resistance to change. Serling understood that television, even though it was seen mostly as entertainment, could be a platform to deal with these contradictions. And so The Twilight Zone became a vehicle for social commentary, delivered through fiction. One of the reasons Serling chose science fiction and fantasy was to get around network censorship. Sponsors and television executives were often uncomfortable with direct discussions about politics or race. But if those issues were wrapped in a story about aliens or distant planets, they were more likely to be approved. Serling once noted that you could talk about serious social issues as long as you disguised them as something else. This approach allowed him to sneak powerful ideas into homes across the country. For example, in the episode Time Enough at Last, a man obsessed with reading survives a nuclear apocalypse, only to break his glasses and find himself unable to read. It's a bleak ending, and while the surface story is about irony, underneath it's a warning about the consequences of isolation and nuclear fear. Another episode, The Shelter, shows neighbors turning on each other in a panic when they think a bomb is about to fall. The message was clear: fear could break down even the strongest of communities. These weren't just entertaining stories, they were moral explorations. Each week, Serling invited the audience to question something about the world they took for granted. What do we do when the rules no longer apply? How do we treat people who are different from us? What happens when we lose faith in the future? But even with his clever use of allegory, Serling still ran into problems. Television in the 1950s and early 1960s was tightly controlled by sponsors. Large corporations didn't want to be associated with anything controversial. That meant writers had to be careful, or else face edits, or even cancellation. Serling knew this all too well. Before The Twilight Zone, he had written a drama called Noon on Doomsday, inspired by the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy in Mississippi whose brutal killing shocked the nation. Serling's original script was heavily censored. The story was changed so much that the victim became an unnamed foreigner, and any direct reference to racism was removed. Serling was deeply frustrated by the changes, and it became a turning point in his career. He realized that if he wanted to say what he really thought, he needed to find a different way to do it. That realization led directly to The Twilight Zone. By using metaphor and symbolism, Serling could write stories that reflected real events and fears without being blocked by the network. He didn't need to say the word racism if the episode clearly showed injustice. He didn't need to point to the Soviet Union if the story was about paranoia and surveillance. He understood that viewers were smart enough to make the connections on their own. Still, not everyone was on board with his approach. CBS executives were often nervous about the show's tone. While The Twilight Zone had a dedicated audience, it was never a major ratings hit. Advertisers occasionally pulled their support, and some affiliates were hesitant to air episodes they thought might upset viewers. Over time, Serling was pressured to tone things down. Even within the flexible format of the show, there were invisible lines he was warned not to cross. But Serling continued to push. In the span of 5 seasons, he wrote or co-wrote 92 of the 156 episodes. He tackled subjects like fascism, mental illness, war crimes, the ethics of technology, and the dehumanizing effects of capitalism. Always, his stories came back to a few core questions. Who are we when no one is watching? What are we capable of under pressure? And what happens when the systems we rely on begin to fail? What made The Twilight Zone especially unique was how it mixed entertainment with introspection. It wasn't telling people what to think, but it was inviting them to think more deeply. That's not easy to do in a 25-minute television episode. And yet, week after week, the show managed to create stories that stuck with viewers long after the credits rolled. Some episodes even predicted trends that would become more relevant decades later. The idea of artificial intelligence, social conformity, and the fear of being watched all appear in multiple episodes. One could argue that shows like Black Mirror or Severance wouldn't exist without the foundation Serling laid. Yet, despite its lasting influence, not all of The Twilight Zone's legacy was preserved equally. While many episodes became classics, others were quietly pushed aside. Some were cut from syndication, removed from home video releases, or ignored in retrospectives. This wasn't because they were poorly made. In many cases, it was because they hit too close to home. They brought up subjects that people weren't ready or willing to confront. In particular, there was one episode that aired in 1964 and was never shown again for over 50 years. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in being too emotionally and politically loaded. That episode was called The Encounter, and it became one of the most mysterious and controversial pieces of Serling's entire career. But this wasn't a lost episode in the usual sense. It wasn't misplaced, and it wasn't forgotten. It was deliberately hidden, buried, because it raised questions the network didn't want to answer. Questions about race, war, guilt, and national identity. And while The Twilight Zone was known for pushing boundaries, The Encounter crossed a line that made the people in charge uncomfortable. The episode itself is simple in structure but heavy in implication. It takes place entirely in a single attic room and features just 2 characters. Neville Brand plays Fenton, a white World War II veteran who is clearing out some old belongings. George Takei, years before his fame from Star Trek, plays a young Japanese-American man named Arthur. The setup suggests a quiet domestic scene. Arthur shows up looking for work, and Fenton offers him a beer. They talk, exchange polite conversation, and appear to be building a tentative friendship. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that this is not a casual meeting. The attic is not just a setting, it's a pressure cooker. A samurai sword becomes the centerpiece of their interaction. Fenton explains that he took it during the war, from a Japanese soldier he killed. Arthur stares at the blade for a little too long. The tension between them builds slowly, then suddenly spikes when Arthur reveals his real name is Taro and claims that his father was a spy for Imperial Japan who helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. From there, the conversation turns into a confrontation. Fenton begins to unravel. He accuses Arthur of being there for revenge. Arthur, in turn, becomes more direct and emotionally unstable. He suggests that the sword is cursed or has a spirit that demands blood. The characters circle around each other, their dialogue becoming sharper, their resentment more exposed. There are no special effects, no dramatic musical cues, just two men in a small space, forced to confront parts of themselves they've tried to bury. The episode ends in violence. It is one of the darkest and most psychologically intense episodes of the entire series, and when it aired, viewers immediately reacted. Some called it racist, others said it was unpatriotic or offensive. Asian American groups objected strongly to the implication that a Japanese American man's father had betrayed the country during World War II. Critics debated what the episode was really trying to say, but CBS didn't offer an explanation. The network simply decided to remove it. In hindsight, that decision says more about the time than the episode itself. In 1964, the United States had not fully reckoned with its own actions during World War II, especially its treatment of Japanese Americans. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in internment camps. These weren't enemy soldiers. They were families, business owners, children, living ordinary lives in cities and towns across the country. They lost homes, jobs, and basic rights, based solely on their heritage. The government justified the internment by claiming it was necessary for national security, but there was no credible evidence of widespread disloyalty among Japanese Americans. The action was later recognized as a violation of civil liberties, and a formal apology wasn't issued until 1988. But in the early 960s, those conversations were only beginning. To air a television episode that even suggested a Japanese American family had aided Japan in wartime wasn't just controversial, it touched a very raw nerve. What made the encounter even more complicated was that it didn't clearly take sides. Fenton, the white veteran, isn't portrayed as a clear-cut hero. He's unstable, aggressive, and deeply haunted by what he did during the war. He admits to killing an unarmed soldier and taking the sword as a trophy. His guilt is visible, his paranoia is rising. Arthur, meanwhile, isn't just a sympathetic victim. His confession about his father is strange and ambiguous. Is it true? Is he repeating something he was told as a child? Or is it a symbolic way of expressing inherited shame? There are no easy answers in the script. There's no narrator to tell us who was right or wrong. Instead, we watch two people carry the weight of history in a confined space, with no clear way out. The sword may or may not be cursed. The truth of Arthur's story may or may not be real. What matters is the emotional truth, the way trauma doesn't just affect individuals, but gets passed from one generation to the next. Rod Serling didn't write the encounter, but he approved it, introduced it, and allowed it to air. The script was written by Martin M. Goldsmith, who also wrote the 1945 noir classic Detour. Like many Twilight Zone episodes, it's more interested in psychological truth than literal facts. The idea wasn't to claim that Japanese Americans were guilty of espionage. It was to explore what happens when people are told they're guilty over and over again, whether they are or not. George Takei later revealed that he had personal reservations about the episode. As a child, he had been sent with his family to one of those internment camps. He remembered the soldiers coming to his house, the loss of freedom, and the injustice of being treated like a criminal without cause. Playing Arthur, a character who confesses to having a father who was a spy, didn't sit well with him. But he also understood the story's complexity. He saw it as a way to open a conversation, even if that conversation was painful. CBS didn't see it that way. At the time, network executives were already wary of Serling's political tone. The show was expensive to produce, and its ratings were slipping. Sponsors didn't want controversy, especially in the middle of the Cold War. When the complaints rolled in after the encounter aired, CBS acted quickly and quietly. The episode was pulled from all future broadcasts. When the series was sold into syndication, the encounter wasn't included. When DVD collections were released, it was missing. For decades, it was as if it had never existed. Among Twilight Zone fans, the episode became something of a myth. Some people had vague memories of seeing it once, late at night. Others passed around low-quality VHS copies that had been taped during the original broadcast. There was debate about whether the network had destroyed the original reel. Others wondered if the controversy had been exaggerated. That changed in 2016. The Sci-Fi Channel, which had acquired rights to air the full Twilight Zone catalogue, made a quiet but important decision. During its annual New Year's Eve marathon, it included the encounter for the first time since its original air date. It wasn't edited. It wasn't accompanied by a disclaimer. It was simply placed back into the rotation. Just another episode, as if it had always been there. The response was immediate. Older fans were surprised. Younger viewers who had never even heard of the episode were caught off guard by its emotional intensity. Some praised the writing and acting. Others still found the subject matter uncomfortable. But the consensus was clear. The encounter wasn't just a footnote in the series. It was one of the most powerful episodes ever made. And perhaps that's exactly why it was buried, because it was too good at doing what the Twilight Zone always tried to do: hold up a mirror to society and ask hard questions. What happens when war doesn't end, but lingers inside the people who fought it? What does it mean to inherit guilt for something your parents did or didn't do? How do you make peace with a country that has never fully made peace with itself? That relevance isn't just about its subject matter. It's about how the episode frames trauma, guilt, and unresolved history. It doesn't offer solutions, and it certainly doesn't make the viewer feel comfortable. But it does something that very few TV shows then or now are willing to do. It makes people reflect on the emotional weight of the past and how that weight is passed down through generations. One of the most powerful aspects of the encounter, especially in retrospect, is the performance of George Takei. What most viewers didn't know at the time, and many still don't, is that Takei had personally lived through the very experience the episode draws upon. As a child, he and his family were taken from their home in Los Angeles and sent to the Roa Relocation Center in Arkansas, one of 10 internment camps used during World War II to hold Japanese Americans. He was 5 years old. He's spoken in interviews and speeches over the years about what that experience was like. He remembers soldiers with guns, the fear in his parents' faces, and the confusion of being treated like an enemy, despite being born and raised in America. His family hadn't broken any laws. They weren't charged with any crimes. They were imprisoned because of their heritage. That experience shaped Takei's worldview. It pushed him toward activism, especially around civil rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and efforts to preserve the memory of internment, so it wouldn't be forgotten or repeated. That background makes his role in the encounter even more complex. His character, Arthur, later revealed to be Tero, doesn't just carry the scars of internment, he carries a much darker belief that his father may have actually been a spy. Whether or not that's true is left deliberately unclear in the script. It could be something he was told as a child, a kind of internalized shame that turned into belief. It could be a metaphor for how deeply he feels betrayed by his country and his identity. Or it could simply be a plot device to force confrontation. Whatever the explanation, the effect is the same. The character becomes a symbol of something that's incredibly difficult to talk about. What happens when marginalized people begin to believe the worst things said about them? What happens when shame is inherited and when people feel responsible for events they didn't cause. On the other side of the attic is Fenton, the white veteran, played by Neville Brand. He's also not a straightforward character. He starts off friendly, if a little blunt, but it quickly becomes clear that he's deeply unstable. He talks about his time in the war with a mix of pride and guilt. He admits to killing an unarmed man and taking the samurai's sword as a trophy. The sword itself becomes more than a physical object. It becomes a stand-in for everything Fenton can't let go of: his fear, his guilt, his identity as a soldier. By the end of the episode, neither man is innocent, but neither is fully to blame. That's part of what makes the story so powerful. It doesn't offer a clean resolution. There's no clear villain and no tidy moral to take away. Instead, it presents a situation where both characters are trapped by their past, by their trauma, and by the expectations society has placed on them. This kind of emotional complexity is part of what makes the encounter so effective. It asks viewers to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that people are rarely just good or bad, right or wrong, to admit that trauma doesn't disappear, even if decades have passed. And perhaps most importantly, it challenges the idea that history can be easily separated from the present. That's a theme that still resonates today. Over the past few years, there has been a noticeable rise in anti-Asian hate crimes in the United States and other countries. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Asian communities were unfairly blamed for the spread of the virus. People were harassed, attacked, and in some cases killed. Old stereotypes and prejudices resurfaced. Some of the language used, like accusations of foreign loyalty or questions about who belongs, mirrored rhetoric from the 1947. For many Asian Americans, this was not a new experience. It was a painful reminder of how quickly suspicion and fear can turn into discrimination. The same ideas that led to internment camps in World War II were still alive, just in different forms. And in that context, the encounter doesn't feel like a relic of the past. It feels immediate. Arthur's character, who carries both grief and anger, becomes a reflection of what it means to grow up in a society that never fully accepts you. His outbursts about his father may not be rational, but it's emotionally honest. It expresses the confusion and bitterness that comes from being seen as both American and suspect. It shows how hard it is to build trust in a place that once locked you away for your ancestry. Fenton's paranoia is also familiar. He's afraid of being judged, of being held accountable, of seeing himself as anything other than a hero. That fear leads him to project blame, to question Arthur's motives, and to treat him as a threat. His refusal to confront his own actions mirrors how many people and countries deal with history. By avoiding responsibility, they create enemies where there may be none. Together, the two characters represent a cycle of trauma. Each man is shaped by violence, each feels betrayed, and each struggles to understand the other. The attic becomes more than just a room. It becomes a space where national memory, personal guilt, and unresolved pain all collide. In a way, the sword at the center of the room is not just a weapon or a war trophy. It's a metaphor for inherited damage, passed from one generation to the next, carrying meaning far beyond its original purpose. By the end of the episode, it's clear that neither Fenton nor Arthur can walk away from that damage. And perhaps that's the point. Some wounds aren't easily healed. Some histories refuse to stay buried. This is what makes the encounter still matter. It doesn't just show two people in conflict. It shows how that conflict is rooted in something larger: systemic injustice, suppressed memory, and the ways people are taught to see each other. It invites viewers to think about how much of what we call history is still alive in our behavior, our fears, and our relationships. When the US government finally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans, it was 1988, over 40 years after the camps had closed. The Civil Liberties Act, signed by President Ronald Reagan, acknowledged that the policy was based not on national security, but on racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of leadership. The apology came with symbolic compensation, but no apology can erase the lived experience of families who lost everything. The encounter captures something that official documents often can't. It captures the emotional truth, the sense of betrayal, the lasting shame, the confusion of being both victim and survivor. It puts that truth in a fictional setting, but it doesn't soften it. Instead, it lets the audience feel just how hard it is to move on when nothing has been fully resolved. And in that way, it continues the best tradition of the Twilight Zone. It uses story not just to entertain, but to challenge. It doesn't offer easy answers, but it does ask urgent questions. What do we owe to those we've wronged? How do we stop repeating the same patterns of fear and blame? And can we ever really escape the past? Or are we all still living in it? When the Twilight Zone entered syndication in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was repackaged for a broader audience. That meant trimming some episodes for time, re-editing others for content, and in certain cases removing episodes entirely. At least 5 episodes were excluded from the original syndication package. One was The Encounter. The others were Miniature, A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain, Sounds and Silences, and An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Together, these form a small but telling group of stories that were, in effect, erased for reasons that had little to do with quality and everything to do with risk. Miniature, which originally aired in 1963, starred a young Robert Duvall as a socially isolated man who becomes obsessed with a miniature dollhouse displayed in a museum. He believes that the figures inside the display are alive, and over time he begins to emotionally withdraw from the real world. The episode is a strange, delicate story about alienation and fantasy, with a tone that's more sad than suspenseful. It wasn't removed because of its themes, but because of a legal dispute. The estate of the episode's writer, Charles Beaumont, claimed that CBS hadn't secured the proper long-term rights to the script. As a result, Miniature was kept out of syndication for decades, even though it had been well received during its original broadcast. It was eventually restored in the early 2000s, once the legal issues were resolved, and included in full on DVD box sets. A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain aired in December 1963. The story follows an older man married to a much younger woman who becomes insecure about their age difference. In an attempt to close the gap, he takes an experimental youth serum, and it works, but too well. He regresses into childhood, leaving his wife to deal with the consequences. The plot reads like a cautionary tale about vanity and the risks of tampering with nature. But it also has a deeply unsettling tone. The episode was removed from rotation due to a legal challenge, possibly over similarities to an unproduced script owned by someone else. Rather than go through a lengthy legal process, CBS simply shelved the episode. Like Miniature, it only returned many years later, quietly added to home media releases without much explanation. Sounds and Silences is another example. It tells the story of a man obsessed with noise, so much so that he eventually develops a condition where every sound, no matter how small, becomes unbearably loud. His life falls apart as he becomes consumed by this hypersensitivity. The episode leans into absurdity at times, but the core idea is about psychological fragility and the pressure of overstimulation. After it aired, CBS was sued by a former Navy officer who claimed the story was based on his life and portrayed him in a defamatory way. Whether the lawsuit had merit or not, the network chose to avoid further legal complications and quietly removed the episode from future broadcasts. The final episode in this group, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, stands apart for a different reason. It wasn't originally produced by the Twilight Zone team. Instead, it was a French short film directed by Robert Enrico and adapted from Ambrose Bierce's classic short story of the same name. CBS purchased the rights to air the film as a special episode during the show's 5th season in 1964. The story follows a man during the American Civil War who is about to be executed. As the rope tightens around his neck, he appears to escape, running through the woods to freedom, only for the final twist to reveal that the entire sequence was a fantasy that occurred in the last moments of his life. The film was haunting, beautifully shot and widely praised, even winning an Academy Award for Best Short Subject. But the agreement CBS signed only allowed for a single broadcast. After that, it was unavailable in the US for decades. Without the rights to rebroadcast it, the episode essentially vanished. It was only through later home video releases and streaming rights negotiations that the episode reappeared. What links all of these cases isn't just the fact that the episodes were missing. It's the reasons behind their absence. They weren't pulled because they were badly made or unpopular. In fact, many were praised by critics and remembered fondly by those who saw them. They were removed because they were considered complicated, legally, thematically, or commercially. And that points to a bigger question: who decides what's too risky to show? Rod Serling knew this struggle well. Even at the height of his career, he constantly battled with sponsors, networks, and censors. He once described his job as the art of self-censorship, not because he wanted to water down his work, but because he knew that anything too direct would be rejected. That's why so many of his stories used science fiction or fantasy to talk about real-world issues. By setting a story on another planet, he could comment on racism. By writing about robots, he could explore authoritarianism. It was a tactic of necessity, not preference. But even the best camouflage didn't always work. When episodes touched on topics that were too raw or too politically sensitive, they were quietly removed. And once they were gone, the system made it easy to forget them. Syndication packages were curated. Local stations chose what to air. DVDs were edited. Streaming platforms, even now, sometimes leave out specific episodes without explanation. The Twilight Zone isn't the only show that's gone through this. Other classic series have also had episodes removed or re-edited to reflect changing standards or to avoid controversy. But The Twilight Zone stands out because of what the show set out to do in the first place. It wasn't just meant to entertain. It was meant to provoke thought, to explore moral ambiguity, to reflect back at viewers the world they lived in, even when that reflection was uncomfortable. In today's media landscape, the language has changed. We don't hear as much about syndication packages or reruns. Now it's about streaming algorithms, brand safety, and content warnings. But the fundamental question is the same. When is a story considered too difficult to show, and who makes that decision? There's an ongoing debate about censorship and cancel culture, with voices on both sides of the conversation. Some argue that removing offensive or outdated content is important to protect viewers, especially those in marginalized communities. Others believe that pulling material from circulation prevents the kind of hard conversations that lead to growth. The truth is, both sides raise valid points. But either way, when something is removed, there's a loss of context, a loss of opportunity, and sometimes a loss of memory. That's why the rediscovery of The Encounter and other long-lost episodes matters. It's not just about completionism or nostalgia. It's about reclaiming the full history of a show that was never afraid to go to uncomfortable places. These stories don't need to be perfect. They need to be seen, understood, and debated. Rod Serling's work still resonates not because it gave us answers, but because it forced us to ask better questions. His legacy lives on in modern shows that carry the same DNA. Programs like Black Mirror, Severance, and other anthology series that mix the eerie with the socially relevant. These shows, much like The Twilight Zone, use fiction to peel back the layers of reality and expose the fears and contradictions beneath. In 2019, CBS All Access rebooted The Twilight Zone with Jordan Peele as host and executive producer. The reboot tackled modern issues, from police brutality to online surveillance, using the same storytelling structure Serling pioneered. Though reviews were mixed, it reminded audiences of the show's lasting impact. More recently, new projects have been announced, including a Twilight Zone comic book series and a planned feature film. These new interpretations suggest that the hunger for stories with a moral edge, stories that explore uncertainty, hasn't gone away. In that sense, the return of The Encounter isn't just about a single episode. It's part of a larger cultural shift, a moment where audiences are more willing to engage with difficult material, more open to questioning past decisions, and more interested in storytelling that challenges as much as it entertains. The Twilight Zone has always been about crossing thresholds between reality and imagination, between comfort and confrontation, between what we believe and what we fear. And sometimes, the most important episodes are the ones that were nearly lost, because they ask the questions we still haven't answered.